Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in March. And March was a very good reading month because I ended up having a week off of work, which of course I spent almost the entire time reading. So I ended up reading 35 books in the month of March. It was a long month and I also had that extra time away, which was really wonderful in terms of the books I was able to finish. So let's get started and dive in. The first book that I read in the month of March is a book called Would You Rather by Allison Ashley. And this is a book basically about like fake marriage trope. It's a woman who quits her job and then in order to maintain her health benefits, she ends up marrying her best friend. And I would say pretty standard romance in terms of like the typical tropes that you might see. Not a 10 that really stood out to it for me, but I enjoyed it. Then I picked up the Harvard Business Review's Guide to Crafting Your Purpose. And this is a book that I actually really enjoyed. I really like books that focus on kind of career evolution and growth and thinking about connecting your values with your passions, with the kinds of things you do on a day-to-day basis. And so that one was really fun to dig into. Next, I picked up The X Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon, and I picked this one up because I really liked this author's other book, Weather Girl. And this is basically about a couple of people who work in public radio and they end up having a romance together. And I actually really liked, this book also had nice representation of mental illness, which also came up in Weather Girl as well. So definitely would recommend that one. Then I picked up Locust Lane by Stephen Amadon, and this is a book that I had on my list because I had just heard a lot of people talking about it. It was recommended by the Washington Post for fans of Mystic River by Dennis Lehane. Basically, it is about a bunch of teenagers who are part of like an investigation that there's a person who dies, and then like the teenagers that were with that person that night are in part of the investigation and are kind of drawn into it. I would say, unfortunately, this book was not super memorable for me. I did listen to it on audio. And when I think about all of the books that I read over this past month, like this one doesn't necessarily stick out. I ended up rating it 3 stars, which means it was fine, but it wasn't necessarily something that was like really strongly sticking out in my memory. Okay. Then I read almost in succession with each other several of the Virgin River books by ROBYN CARR. And this is a series that I don't think it even matters to go into the plot of each of these different books, because basically what you have is a character in the town and the character has a romance. And all of the characters are interconnected throughout the series, and so you kind of get to know them over time. I had all of these books, I'm just checking to make sure here. Yeah, I was on 15, which is called Hidden Summit. And so I finished that. And I didn't read them all back to back, but it's just worth mentioning them all here, you know, as I'm talking about the first one. So 16 is called Redwood Bend. And then 17 of the series is called Sunrise Point. 18 is a Christmas themed book, which was kind of fun. It's called My Kind of Christmas. And then number 19 is called Return to Virgin River. And I'm pretty sure that this is the end of the series. It kind of wraps up. Return to Virgin River, let's see, the date on this one was 2020. So I suppose it's possible the author will add more on that. But for right now, it was really fun to just close out that series. And that one is now wrapped up. I also picked up a book called Someday Maybe by Ani Nwabineli. And this is a book that I had also heard a ton of people talking about. And basically it is about a woman who is grieving the loss of her partner who dies by suicide. And it's about kind of her and her Nigerian family and how they're kind of dealing with, you know, this situation. I actually really liked this. I mean, I wasn't sure what to expect with it. I do feel like it was a really poignant kind of reflection on grief and how that looks different for everyone. And so this is definitely one that, I mean, although the subject matter is kind of tough, I actually would highly recommend that one as well. All right, then I picked up The House in the Pines, and this is a Reese's Book Club book, so it was just kind of everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. It basically is about a woman who witnesses her friend's kind of sudden death, and then years later she's trying to figure out what happened because another person dies in kind of similar circumstances. This is one that I thought was interesting, but I also found it to be like not super memorable. I felt like it was using a lot of tropes that other books are currently using, which is basically like a crime happens in a woman's past when she's like a young girl, and then it kind of comes back to haunt her and she's trying to solve what happened in that crime. There's a lot of books I've read recently that kind of fall into this trope. So I rated this one 3 stars. I mean, I don't think in like a year I'm really gonna like remember exactly what was going on in this book. But I enjoyed it, and I thought that for a book that's kind of if you're looking for like a thriller, it definitely will keep you engaged. Okay, then I picked up a book called Meredith Alone by Claire Alexander, and I feel like this book is kind of like Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. Like it's if you like that kind of book, and I've read a couple of them that are similar to this in the past couple of months, where it's basically a woman who for various reasons has kind of isolated herself in her apartment. She's agoraphobic. She doesn't want to leave her apartment. And of course, over the course of the story, we come to understand why. And she forms relationships with different people who kind of come to her or call her on the phone, but she's not necessarily leaving her apartment. And then she starts to make some friends where she wants to start to leave, and she starts to kind of heal from past trauma that was keeping her kind of at home. I really liked this one. And I thought it was really, really nicely done. Okay, then I picked up The American Roommate Experiment by Elena Armas. This is the second book in, I guess you could call it a series, although I think they stand alone just fine. The first book is The Spanish Love Deception by the same author, which I really, really enjoyed. This one I would say I would rate second compared to The Spanish Love Deception, but I still really liked it. And basically, it's the story of a girl named Rosie who is staying in her friend's apartment because of something that's going on in her own apartment and some construction that's needed in her own apartment. And while she's staying in her friend's apartment, her friend's cousin comes from out of town, and she doesn't realize that he's going to be in town. And this is someone that for a while she's been kind of stalking on social media and kind of has a crush on, and has never met in real life. And then they're kind of thrown together living in the same apartment. She is also a romance writer, the main character. And so they have kind of this fake dating trope where she's trying to use their fake dating as kind of inspiration for her next romance novel. I thought it was really cute. And if you like the sound of that, I would definitely start with the first one, The Spanish Love Deception, and then graduate into this one. The first book is about the best friend of Rosie. And so we hear about that couple first, and then the next one in the next book. Okay, then I picked up a book by a new author I'd never encountered before called Don't You Forget About Me by Mari McFarlane. And this is a book that, trying to think of like why I picked this up. I think I just like liked the sound of it. Like I stumbled across it. And then I decided to like find a bunch of other books by this author, which I'll probably be reading in the next month. But basically this is the story about a woman named Georgina who goes to school, kind of in high school, with a boy named Lucas, and they have a relationship in high school. And then several years later, when they are, I think she's like kind of in her early 30s or late 20s, she runs into him and he doesn't recognize her. And she recognizes him like immediately. And they end up working together in this bar. And it's basically about them kind of rekindling their relationship up from when they were like teenagers, basically. Very cute. I actually really liked there was kind of a circle of friends around Georgina that are also kind of a very funny addition to this book as well. So definitely I would say kind of like a romantic comedy. Okay, and then one of my books that was my alphabet reading challenge for this month was Confessions on the 745 by Lisa Unger. And this is a book that I believe is being adapted, if it hasn't already been adapted. And basically it's about a couple of women who like run into each other on the train. And they both have like these secrets that they kind of confess to each other as strangers. And then the woman, the main woman, Selena, basically her nanny goes missing, and she isn't sure if it's like connected to this confession that she gave to this woman on the train, which is she just found out that her husband was having an affair with the nanny, and then the nanny goes missing. And so the book is basically trying to figure out like what happened to the nanny. Who is this woman who was on the train, and is there any kind of connection, you know, between her confessing this and then the nanny that goes missing? I actually really liked this. I thought it was really, there were some kind of twists that I didn't see coming, and that's always a sign of a good thriller for me. Okay, then I picked up Two Wrongs Make a Right by Chloe Leese, and this is the same author that also has written what is the name of this series? The Bergman Brothers romance series was written by the same author. And this one I thought was really, it sounded kind of cute because it's basically a reimagining of Much Ado About Nothing by Shakespeare, where you have a couple of people, Jamie and Bee, who don't have anything in common. They really don't like each other, but basically to like assuage their family's concerns, they decide to do like fake dating. And then of course, in the process of fake dating, they end up falling for each other and having a relationship. Similar to the Bergman Brothers romance series, this author often brings in neurodivergence and disability and other kinds of things into her romance, and this is also the case of this book as well. So highly would recommend that. All right, then I picked up a book called Blood Sugar by Sasha Rothschild. This is a book that I picked up because the New York Times had it on its list of like top mystery and thrillers, I think for like 2022. And I'd never heard of it, and I'd never read this author before. And basically what I really liked about this is there's a main character named Ruby, and she's actually been involved in murdering people 3 times throughout her life. And then she gets accused of murdering her husband, who she didn't murder. But because she's been kind of involved in these other kinds of deaths, there's a lot of suspicion on her that she's somehow involved in her husband's murder. And so it starts in like a police interrogation room, and you're basically hearing someone talking with her about these other murders, and then she's giving backstory on these other murders. And so you find out what happened that kind of led up to the death of her husband. But she is saying that she's innocent, that she did not, kill her husband. I thought it was actually really creative and interesting, and I really like that one. All right, then I picked up Mary Kubica's Just the Nicest Couple. This is an author that I've definitely read before. And in this case, we have, there's 2 couples and 2 women who are close friends, Nina and Lily. And what we end up having happen is one of the husbands goes missing, and the other couple, the woman in the other couple of the husband that goes missing, she saw him right before he went missing. And so she kind of discloses this to her partner, and they become kind of embroiled in this situation of like the missing husband. And it's kind of going back and forth between the 2 couples and like trying to figure out what happened to this husband that went missing. I will say that partway through the book, I kind of figured out like what was going on, and I had like a guess of what I thought was going on here, and I was right. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good book, but I would say this is one that, of this author's books, there was another one I read called Local Woman Missing that I really, really enjoyed, and I would not put this one up with that one in terms of just like twists and really not knowing what was going on. All right, then I read The City Baker's Guide to Country Living. This was another one of my Alphabet Challenge books for March. And basically it felt a lot to me like a romance that you would see on like the Hallmark Channel, like where it's basically a woman who moves to a small town. She's gotten, I think, like fired from her job, and she's trying to remake herself and like form new relationships. And she ends up working at the Sugar Maple Inn, and she gets offered a job there, and then begins to like meet people around the town. It's not as like sugary sweet as a Hallmark movie, but it's close in terms of the kinds of things that you see happening here. I like this kind of book. I feel like it's kind of a palate cleanser. It's just like nice and pretty positive in terms of the themes. So if you're looking for something like that, would recommend it. Okay, then I picked up a book that I feel like everybody had been talking about. It's called Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This was a 5-star read for me. I really loved it. It's basically the story of a woman who dies, and she leaves behind this audio recording for her 2 children, a son and a daughter, to listen to understand her past history. Now, it would give away a ton of spoilers to say anything about the content of this audio, and it starts like very quickly, and you very quickly start to understand like the backstory of this woman. I thought this was great. I loved how there were like little reveals that happened throughout the book. I loved the family. I loved how the family at various points in the book is kind of broken, and then they have to come back together and like heal with each other. This one was really, really good. I would definitely recommend that one. I also picked up a book called The Book of Lost Names by Kristen Harmel. And this is basically a book about a woman who becomes a forger in World War II to try to help Jewish children flee the Nazis. And she ends up using this book, which is what the title refers to, The Book of Lost Names, to basically like hide the true names of who she's creating forged documents for. So like the children can eventually be reunited with their families. And basically what ends up happening is, as an adult, she sees this book of lost names, like it's being covered in like the news, like somebody has like uncovered this book. And then the rest of the book is basically the backstory of like what this book is and her story and how she became a forger. This was a book that when I started reading it at night, and I like couldn't put it down. Like it was very like fast paced. There was a lot going on in the early part of the book. And I really wanted to know, like what was happening with these characters. And so I really like this one. I mean, I think that it was a nice mix of kind of going back and forth with present day and then the history of the story of the book. All right, then next I picked up a book called 9 Liars by Maureen Johnson. This is the 5th book, I believe, in the Truly Devious series, which is basically about a high school student who solves crimes. And the first book in this series is probably my favorite, where she's like solving this very long standing mystery of her boarding school. And it's something that she kind of gets sucked into. And this is like why she comes to the school, is to try to solve this mystery. In this particular book, it is about her going to England to visit her boyfriend who's studying abroad, and then solving a crime while she's there. There's some fun stuff going on in terms of like the character development with this particular book, in that there are a series of like these high school students, and we're like learning about them as they're learning about themselves. And that was probably my favorite part of this. The plot I could have kind of taken or left. Like it wasn't like super exciting to me, but I really loved how the characters are being developed over time. Definitely start from the beginning of this series if you want to dive in. Then I picked up a book of poetry called How to Fly and 10,000 Easy Lessons by Barbara Kingsolver. I had not read Barbara Kingsolver's poetry before. I've read her other books like the Poisonwood Bible and other things that she has written, but I had not like encountered her poetry. And so I thought I would just pick it up. I find poetry to be very subjective in terms of like whether you like it, whether you don't like it. But I found that Barbara Kingsolver, I just find her really gifted. Like her novels, her poetry is very tied in with like nature and like animals and weather and the earth and all these different kinds of things. And I really enjoyed it. It was nice to just kind of like dig in and try her in a different medium. Okay, then I had one of my books that was a alphabet challenge book. It was actually the second book in a series, which I did not realize. So I had to, of course, pick up the first book in the series because I don't like to read things out of order. So I picked up The Diary of a Bookseller by Sean Bythell. And then the second book in that series is called Confessions of a Bookseller, same author. And basically this is a like interesting little series of this person who's in Scotland and he owns a bookstore. And he is basically telling stories about being a secondhand bookseller. And apparently this is like the largest secondhand bookshop in Scotland. and it has 100,000 books in it. And he has various people who kind of work for him. And so you get to hear about like the town, the people who work for him, the customers who are coming to this shop. It's very quaint. And he has kind of a wit, you know, like a very witty way of like describing what's going on. I don't feel like these couldn't stand alone. So if you wanted to read like the second one, you didn't necessarily have to read the first one. I also saw there's a third book that's come out that he's also sharing like more stories of this bookstore. If you like books, I think you would enjoy this. I mean, I think that otherwise it may not be, you know, enough to draw you in. All right, then I finally read a book that has been on my pile for a very long time called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain. Everyone tells me about this book because I am a dedicated introvert and am always looking to learn more about this. I really enjoyed this book. What I would say is because I have read very broadly on this topic, there was not a lot in here that was new to me. However, I think when this book would have first come out, which is 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, it would have been really significant in terms of the literature. So if you're just getting started with the topic of introversion, I would highly, highly recommend it. All right, then I picked up The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. This is a book that recently got adapted, and so I wanted to pick it up before I watched the adaptation. And it was also part of the Reese Book Club, and so it's been just kind of everywhere in terms of being on social media and everybody recommending it. But I really liked the premise of it, which is basically that a woman marries a man who already has a child, and so she has this like stepdaughter. And one day the man leaves a note that basically says, you know, protect my daughter, but then he disappears. And she doesn't know why he has disappeared. And she goes about this journey of like trying to understand what happened and like why he has run away. I will say that there are several points of the plot in this book where I thought you're making a leap that the character would do that. So for example, like early on in the book, the character kind of finds a clue that she thinks tells her where she needs to go to like fly somewhere to learn more about this person who's her partner. I don't know that like everyone would have seen the clue and or like decided to jump on a plane and like, or get in a car and like go on this trip to like follow up on the clue. But if you're willing to kind of like set that aside and just kind of follow along with the plot, I actually found this to be really interesting. I didn't necessarily see where it was going. I listened to it on audio and really enjoyed this one on audio, so would recommend that one too. Okay, then I had another book that was on my Alphabet Challenge list, and I loved this one. It's called A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. I am a huge Bridget Kemmerer fan. I've read her other stuff, several of her other novels that typically fall into kind of like the young adult romance. This is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and I really, really enjoyed it. I listened to it on audio. I thought it was really well done. Basically, there's a girl who lives in DC. Her name is Harper, Washington, DC. And through various events, she gets kind of like kidnapped and taken into another realm where she is supposed to fall in love with this prince and save him from this curse. And if you know Beauty and the Beast, you have a general sense of like where this plot is going. One of the things that is kind of interesting is that Harper has cerebral palsy. And so this becomes kind of part of the plot in like an interesting way. And she has to figure out how she can kind of save this kingdom. Now, this is the first of 2 other books that are in the series. So it's a trilogy, and I like immediately went out and bought the other 2 and made sure that I had access to them. I love them on audio, so I ended up getting them on audio because I knew I wanted to listen to them that way. Highly, highly recommend that one. Okay, then I picked up the latest in the Joe Pickett series by CJ Box. It's called Stormwatch. This is book number 23 in the series. I am pretty much caught up with this series except for one random book that I missed in the middle somehow, so I will go back and read it at some point. But basically, this series is about a Wyoming game warden named Joe Pickett, and he basically always finds random bodies when he's doing his job out in the woods and then has to solve these crimes. And as you can see from me reading 23 books in this series, or 22, I really like it. I think it's a great series. I love that Joe Pickett's family gets involved in these different storylines. And so you see his daughters growing up over time. You see his relationship with his wife evolving. He also has a strong relationship with a character named Nate Romanowski, who is basically a falconer and who also is kind of like into shady kinds of dealings, and is like ex-military and is often coming in to like save Joe from various situations. It's a great series. I would highly recommend starting it from the beginning, but that was a fun one to revisit. Then I picked up a very fast read. It's called How to Be Weird, an Off-Kilter Guide to Living a One-of-a-Kind Life by Eric Wilson. This is a book that is basically like tiny little essays about different like exercises that you can do to embrace, kind of being a little bit more weird or like off-kilter in your life. And it includes things like, taking aimless walks and exploring the underside of bridges. I mean, like just kind of random little things. And I thought it was fine. Like it doesn't really stick out in a memorable way to me, but I like reading little books of essays and just kind of hearing, like what are people's opinions on how to do that kind of thing. Okay, after that, I read Look Closer by David Ellis. I listened to this on audio, and this is a book that I had seen a lot of people talking about. One of the best parts about this book is there was a new reveal, I would say every 50 pages. And this is a book that is about 450 pages long. So lots of different reveals throughout the book that kind of draw you deeper and deeper and deeper into the storyline. So basically you have a wealthy Chicago couple. He's a law professor and she's an advocate for domestic violence victims. And they have this marriage. And then you basically find out that everything is not as it seems. There's another woman who's found killed and they are somehow involved in her death. And like how you find out how they are involved in their death is what is kind of revealed throughout the story. I really like this one. Would definitely recommend it if you have time to kind of sink into a longer thriller. Okay, then I picked up a book by Tessa Bailey called Fix Her Up, which is, I think, the first one in a series that she writes. And this is one that I would say it was kind of a tough one for me. It was a romantic comedy. I liked aspects of it. You have the main character, Georgette, who is like a party planner, basically. Like she plans children's parties. And then she has like her brother's best friend, Travis, who is like a former baseball player, but then he is like injured and can't do it anymore. And then he's basically trying to redo his image because he was kind of like a bad boy. And she feels like she is like never taken seriously by her family and wants to be taken more seriously. And so they start to kind of date each other. It's like a fake dating trope. So that he can be kind of seen as legit, in terms of like being in a real relationship, and like she can also feel legitimized in the eyes of her family. I feel like this one was a little bit tough because it starts out where she has had kind of a crush on this guy since she was a kid. He's always seen her as kind of his best friend's little sister. And their relationship didn't always make sense to me in terms of like how it was unfolding, in the book. But I mean, it was fine. I mean, I guess it kind of hung together. It also has kind of this whole like home renovation kind of theme that was interesting. I don't know. I feel like there's other romances I've read that I would definitely recommend more than this one. So feel free to like read the synopsis and see if it might be a fit for something you're interested in. Okay, then I read the first book in Kyla Stone's Edge of Collapse series. It is called Edge of Collapse. And this book also had like a prequel book called Chaos Rising that tells kind of the backstory of one of the characters. I was completely sucked into this purely because of the plot synopsis. And I had it available on audio, and so I decided to dive into it kind of randomly one night. So basically this is where there's an EMP attack. And this is an electromagnetic pulse attack where basically it wipes out the power grid. And so there's no electricity, no cars work, no phones work. I mean, if you have to kind of look this up to understand like the wide, broad scale of destruction that this would cause, it's massive. Basically, like everything goes into chaos. And there's a woman named Hannah who has been held captive by a killer, basically, for 5 years, and she gets to escape because of this EMP attack. which we know nothing about like where this EMP attack came from. Like none of that is covered in the first book. I'm sure it comes up later on. So she like runs away into the woods of like Michigan. She's like in rural Michigan. And while she's in the woods, she runs into this ex-soldier named Liam. And he is like, basically he's actually the backstory that we get in like the little mini like prequel is like how he comes into the woods, like what happens to him and his family. But they're basically both affected by this EMP attack. And they basically pair up because she is running away from this guy, and she eventually tells Liam like what this history is, and he's trying to kind of like protect her from the situation. And oh, she happens to be pregnant. That's like a whole other situation going on here. It's obviously very dark, you know, in terms of the plot and the storyline, because like the killer who was holding her hostage is like coming after her and like trying to find her. But I was like totally drawn in. I thought it was super fun. I will totally keep reading the series. Like I think it's just really interesting. And the concept of like basically civilization collapsing and having like a post-apocalyptic world that you're trying to navigate is totally interesting to me. So that was a fun one that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And then the last book that I read of the month was also one that was an alphabet challenge book for me. And this is called Coached to Death by Victoria Laurie. I have to say I went into this with very low expectations of what this book would be. It is basically about a life coach who solves crimes. And by the way, she used to run her own marketing agency and she sold it for $50 million. And so she has just all the money in the world and can kind of do whatever she wants. I will say the life coaching part of this book, very minimal, like 5% of what's going on in this book, because she ends up having this like very contentious relationship with one of her neighbors. They all live in these mansions and they're fighting with each other. And then one of these women like ends up dead and she's blamed, you know, for the murder of this woman. What became very clear to me as I was reading this is that the author has a couple of other series that are being merged into this book. So for example, the main character, Catherine, her sister is like a psychic. And we hear about this at like multiple points of the book. And that's like a separate series that this author writes. And then she also has this best friend named Gilly. And like Gilly used to work with like another person who was like a private investigator, and they like solved crimes together. And that's like another series that this author writes. So this is like a third series, I think, that this author is starting to write. And just like glancing online, there's now 4 books in this particular series, but at least one of the other series, which is I think it's called the Psychic Eye Mysteries, I think there's like almost 20 books in that series. So this author's been doing this for a while, and I have never heard of her and I'd never read her before. So, but I will say, very entertaining. If you're willing to set aside a woman who sells her business for $50 million and basically can kind of do whatever she wants and lives this very privileged life and then ends up like solving these crimes, you have to set aside some stuff in order to just like really enjoy it and find it kind of fun and interesting. But you know, it was definitely one of those books that it was entertaining. I'll say that. I could definitely see it being turned into like a little like mini series or something like that on TV, just because it's got like some really wacky characters in it. Okay. So those are the 35 books that I read in the month of March, some really fun ones in there. And soon I am excited to dive into the books that I'm going to read in April. If you stick around, feel free to look for that video where I'm going to be talking about all the books I plan to read in the month ahead. But until then, happy reading.